Еще буквально секунду. Мгм. И можем начинать. Дорогие друзья, большое спасибо, что присоединяетесь к нам. Сегодня мы начинаем, буквально только наступил 21 год, и мы сразу же начинаем публичную программу «Шестой Уральской индустриальной биеннале» и обращаемся к программе, которая начала работать быстрее всех. Это программа арт-резиденций. И сегодня у нас очень плотное и разнообразное событие, о котором скажу буквально через пару секунд, но вначале дам пару буквально технических комментариев. Многие из вас уже, возможно, провели несколько месяцев в бесконечных зумах и уже освоились в цифровом этикете, но для тех из вас, кто не так часто бывает, ну и для всех других на самом деле тоже, а, просто проговорю какие-то базовые правила. У нас будет в рамках сегодняшнего события у нас будет один полноценный доклад, одна большая дискуссия и несколько пространств для вопросов и ответов. Если же в течение презентации у вас будут появляться какие-то вопросы, убедительно прошу вас просто писать их в чат. В случае, когда у нас будет начинаться открытая сессия вопросов и ответов, я обязательно это проговорю. И в этом случае я буду просить каждого, кто хочет включиться или задать вопрос, предварительно поднять руку, и мы включим вам видео и звук, либо же вы включите сами, чтобы задать вопрос. Но во все остальное время, когда вы не говорите, когда нет пространства для вопроса, я бы попросил держать и камеру, и звук выключенными. В остальном встреча, мы рассчитываем, что встреча продлится около 1,5 часов, может быть, с небольшим продлением. Надеюсь, что это соотносится с вашими расписаниями, правилами и графиками. И здесь, наверное, есть еще безусловный плюс зумов. Всегда можно выключить камеру и куда-то ненадолго убежать, что, конечно, намного сложнее делать, когда мы сидим в одном пространстве в свете софитов. С техническими комментариями покончил и поговорю как раз о повестке встречи. Сегодня мы презентуем первый проект, который включается в новую программу программу арт-резиденций шестой Уральской индустриальной биеннале современного искусства. И это проект Бехзадом Нури, о котором мы сегодня будем говорить вместе с Behzadом. И сейчас я поступательно представлю всех участников сегодняшнего разговора. С нами сегодня Владимир Селезнев, художник, куратор и как раз куратор этой итерации программы резиденций. С нами Behzad Нури, философ, художник, исследователь. Он живет в Стокгольме и Тегеране, работает с проблемами глобального юга, проблемами концептуализации труда и средств производства и с очень интересными культурными оттисками и артефактами поздней холодной войны. И с нами же сегодня Мария Линд, куратор, писатель и преподаватель, советник по культуре Швеции и атташе по культуре посольства Швеции в Москве. И замечу, что резиденция Behzada как раз поддерживается отделом культуры посольства Швеции в Москве и делает возможным как наш сегодняшний разговор, так и его дальнейшую работу в одном из городов Свердловской области. Сегодня мы будем говорить о проекте «Памятник невидимому гражданину», и структура нашей встречи такова. В самом начале Владимир Селезнев коротко расскажет о программе резиденций, Затем Behzad расскажет о этом проекте и о своей художественной практике. Потом будет как раз пространство для вопросов и ответов, связанных с работами Behzad. И затем, в силу того, что его проект очень сильно связан с идеей партиципаторности, гражданского вовлечения, мы немного поговорим о разных кейсах как раз художественных проектов, предполагающих гражданское соучастие. И это будет открытая дискуссия, к которой мы тоже пригласим вас подключиться. Будем здесь опираться и на, безусловно, грандиозный опыт Марии, опыт Владимира, и надеемся на ваши ремарки в том числе. Вот, теперь со всеми формальностями покончено. Еще раз большое спасибо, что подключились, и я предоставляю слово Владимиру.
Дим, спасибо большое. Ну, начну немного истории. Программа арт-резиденций на Уральской биеннале появилась не сразу, в 2012 году, то есть со второго биеннале. И за это время художниками из 10 стран было создано 30 проектов, приняли участие 25 городов в программе и 23 предприятия, расположенных в этих городах. Это в основном города Свердловской и Челябинской области, и также было, кажется, один раз у нас подключение Пермского края. Вот, программа, надо сказать, что мне кажется, что это вторая по значимости программа биеннале, то есть она важна как раз с работой художников с нашим уральским индустриальным контекстом. То есть художники не просто делают какую-то работу, которую они могли бы сделать там где угодно у себя дома и так далее, а они приезжают и как бы ориентируясь на контекст того города, где они находятся, или того предприятия, с которым они работают, они создают работу, исходя из этого контекста. Теперь я расскажу о, как мне кажется, 3 принципиальных вещах, которые отличают программу арт-резиденций этого года от прошлых лет. Первое, один из основных принципов этого года – это партиципаторность. Художники создают проекты не просто ориентируясь на контекст, да, а при активном соучастии жителей городов, при соучастии городских сообществ. Формы взаимодействия могут быть самые разнообразные, от общения до прямого включения в создание работ. Это могут быть как объекты или выставки, так и перформативные или театральные проекты. Второе. В этом году мы впервые объявили open call для городов, желающих принять участие в арт-резиденциях. То есть те города, которые хотели заявиться на участие в арт-резиденции, могли это сделать. И мы оцениваем этот конкурс очень положительно. В результате мы набрали около 20 заявок от разных городов Свердловской и Челябинских областей. Даже те города, которые по разным причинам не смогут в дальнейшем, в смысле не смогут попасть в программу арт-резиденции этого года, в дальнейшем, я думаю, мы продолжим с ними какое-то общение, мы не будем терять их из виду и там сделаем маршруты биеннале или как-то, я думаю, мы продолжим с ними работу. В программу арт-резиденции этого года войдет не более 10 городов, потому что это довольно тяжело делать выставки или проекты, да, в разных местах Свердловских и Челябинских областей, и поэтому мы как бы не можем взять, к сожалению, больше. Третье важное отличие программы этого года. Впервые, наверное, художники будут создавать свои работы в городах, в которых проходят арт-резиденции. А не так, как было в прошлые года, когда неважно, в каком городе художник находился, но свой итоговый проект он создавал на площадке в Екатеринбурге. Мы делаем арт-резиденции более последовательными. Если раньше он был центростремительным, то работы итоговые свозились в Екатеринбург, города использовались как ресурс, то теперь все произведения остаются именно в этих городах, в которых они создавались, неважно в каком формате они будут представлены. Но в Екатеринбурге по итогам арт-резиденций будет создана видеоинсталляция, рассказывающая про города, художников и их проекты. Так что вектор нынешнего биеннале – это рассредоточение, то есть вот как бы основываясь на названии, мы размыкаем объятия, да, и как бы вот стараемся как можно дальше, да, эти объятия распространить. При этом все желающие, кто, допустим, приезжает на основной проект биеннале или приходит на основной проект биеннале в Екатеринбурге, они могут также посетить города арт-резиденций, потому что предполагается выездные маршруты биеннале, то есть все, кто захочет увидеть работы наших резидентов, они смогут отправиться самостоятельно или ну, согласно автобусам, да, которые будут курсировать до этих городов. Что еще? В ходе подготовки проекта в городах в рамках публичной программы обязательно будут проходить специальные мероприятия с участием как художника, меня как куратора, так и ну, какие-то ну, такие, я не знаю, это могут быть мастер-классы или лекции по современному искусству, ну, то есть что-то обязательно будет происходить помимо того, что художник просто работает в городе. Это тоже одна из таких важных для нас историй, которую мы собираемся поддерживать. Ну и, не знаю, наверное, в целом все. Я бы хотел поблагодарить Марию Линд за ее экспертное участие в этом году и то, что Мария познакомила с таким прекрасным и, на мой взгляд, стопроцентно вписывающимся в стратегию арт-резиденции этого года проектом Бехзада. Несмотря на то, что Бехзада вдохновила, казалось бы, никак не пересекающиеся с уральской индустриальной историей, совершенно другая история, да, загребский вот мультсериал про профессора Бальтазара. Но само это произведение, что мне кажется важно, создает занимательную ситуацию сопричастности зрителей, объединяя детскую игру с серьезными проблемами современности. Проект является как приглашением к игре, так и приглашением к размышлению, что, мне кажется, очень важно. Ну, наверное, у меня все, и я бы уступил место Бехзаду.
Ну, я как раз хотел предложить Марии представить Behzada, раз как раз она совершила это знакомство и, да, в общем-то, инициировала этот контакт. Кажется, совершенно это просто неотъемлемое право рассказать историю этого знакомства. Мария, пожалуйста, вам слово.
Thank you so much, and hello, everyone. I'm super glad that this collaboration is happening between the Ural Industrial Biennial, which I have visited a few times, and which I often quote as one of the most interesting biennials in the world, and I've seen quite a few so far, and Behzad Khosravi Noori, very interesting artist with whom I have been working for several years. And in this case, when we started to talk about some kind of collaboration with the residency program of the Ural Biennial, I thought of Behzad's work and Behzad as a person in relation to how you, Behzad, are dealing with a certain legacy, a Cold War legacy, where you have developed a work that addresses what is called the non-aligned movement. In other words, a third position that did not go for the Warsaw Pact or for NATO, led by Egypt, Yugoslavia, and India, but with many countries in the global south being engaged, starting in the 50s, and the heyday of the non-aligned movement was definitely in the 60s. And how you've done this through popular culture, furthermore, popular culture addressing children through the, in Sweden, very well-known cartoon, Professor Bальтазар, which was shown on state television at the time when there was only state television in Sweden, and which everybody of certain generations would be familiar with. And as you yourself, Behzad, sometimes have mentioned, there are people sharing childhood memories who normally would not share childhood memories, people who never met, because typically it's with your family or your classmates or the people living close to you that you share reminiscences from when you grew up. But in fact, because we watch the same program and it's not Disney, I can share some of these memories with people from ex-Yugoslavia, from Iran, like yourself, and from many other parts of the world. It's a fascinating project, and I think it will resonate interestingly in Ural. And what I have also proposed in this context is to be very aware of the conditions on the ground, that it's less than 10 months until the opening of the biennial, and the residencies will start even sooner. And participatory work usually takes a lot of time to prepare, to embed, and so on. So I think it's interesting to think of how an existing work can land somewhere and can create a context, can facilitate encounters on site, and something new can grow out of that. So in a way, the social practice part, the participatory part, is very much connected to the mediation of an existing artwork that can be presented in a particular way that works with that context somehow, that resonates interestingly with that context. What that will be is unclear now, but it will probably clarify along the way. So as this is also my first real project as the Counselor of Culture at the Embassy of Sweden in Moscow, I started in August. I am particularly pleased now to ask Behzad to take the Zoom stage for a presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Maria. It was really pleasure it's absolutely pleasure to be part of that residency, and thank you for very warm introduction, Maria. And as you mentioned, is actually very much odd form of childhood memory that people from certain countries and certain generation shared. And based on that sharing the specific memory from our childhood, perhaps the main question of this project or the other project that I'm doing is that what will happen for our collective past in the future? So what should we do with those kind of things that we know? So in order to bring you into the realm of Professor Bальтазар and the kind of the idea that I have started to work with, I thought that it's better to watch one episode of Professor Bальтазар. It's 7 minutes. It's quite fun. but at the same time, it creates the environment that we could understand what we are going to talk and where we are coming from for that particular project. And the project that I'm going to talk about it after that, A Monument to the Invisible Citizen, is actually continuation somehow from that specific episode of Professor Bальтазар, which as is already discussed, it was a production, animation production from Zagreb film during the 60s and 70s. So I share my monitor, and we watch one episode, is almost 7 minutes episode, and then for the kind of 18 minutes left of my talk, I go through and tracing that different aspects of that project to see that how does it function and what is my point of view and positionality within that specific amazing yep.
Бальтазар, 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 Бальтазар.
In Professor Bальтазар's town, there lived a man named Martin. He would have been quite an ordinary Martin, except that he had a big problem. Nobody noticed him. Martin was miserable. Nobody, absolutely nobody, ever noticed him. One day, he went to Professor Bальтазар for advice. Bальтазар opened the door, and of course, he didn't notice Martin. Martin was persistent. Well, for the first time in his life, Martin was noticed. Martin poured out his heart. Professor Balthazar started thinking how he could help him. And he had it. He invented a book for him called How to Climb to the Top of Success. But every page in it was empty. The professor quickly explained it was Martin's job to fill the pages with the story of his success. Full of hope, Martin said goodbye to the professor and started off. Martin left town. And how strange. At that very moment, people began to notice the absence of a man whom they had never noticed before. Now, suddenly, everybody missed him. People felt a little guilty. And so they went to Professor Balthazar. But even he didn't know where Martin was. The entire town was looking for Martin, but in vain. He had disappeared completely. In a special session, the city council decided to erect a monument in Martin's memory. But since nobody recalled exactly what Martin looked like, only the pedestal of the monument was ceremoniously unveiled. It was a monument to the unknown citizen. Meanwhile, up on a high, high mountain, on its very peak, Martin was living happily with his new friend, Arthur the Eagle. Professor Balthazar often thought of Martin and wondered whether he had found happiness at last. Until one day, the answer came right through the window.
Bальтазар, Бальтазар, Бальтазар.
I stop sharing and then I start share my presentation, which is some of the images of the exhibitions that I have done, and somehow we get back to that idea. Could you see my presentation now? Yep. Okay. You watch the animation. This is actually the point of departure of everything that I'm going to talk about. And shortly, there was a city was called Baltazar, And you could see in the introduction as a scenography, you could see some sort of modern utopian city that a lot of people with different interests and characters live in that city. And well, it's a real city, and sometimes people have a problem. And when they have a problem, they go to a professor, and that professor, Professor Bальтазар, thinks, and by thinking, his thought materialize in a drop of magic liquid from the very kind of spectacular machine that he has, and he solves the problem. Always he solves the problem. And the fun part of this kind of amazing repeatual story, that you have a problem, you go to Professor Bальтазар with the same technique solve your problem, is that interestingly, you go to a professor to solve your problem. So somehow for me, it's a kind of like a pure representation of modernity that somehow is very much embedded in that form of mentality. The science, the imagination could help you. So the project is very much related to that episode of animation, Professor Bальтазар, a monument to the cities, Professor Bальтазар and a monument to the invisible citizen, produced by this group of people. The guy that you can see in the left is Zlatko Gergic, who was actually the director of Professor Bальтазар episodes. And it's very important to mention that Zagreb film was very much into animation production during the Cold War, and it was somehow the center of animation production in Eastern countries, Eastern European countries. And majority of animation that were produced by Zagreb Film were not necessarily animation for kids. So they were very much philosophical animation. They were targeting adults. They had some sort of anti-capitalist mentality. They were leftist, the majority of them. Some of them, they were Tito's comrade. Some of them, they were partisan. One of them was the head of Communist Party in Yugoslavia. So they were very much kind of producing leftist-oriented animation in a way. And then among those kind of animation, that is absolutely fantastic. So hopefully during my residency, I will try to review some of those animation in relation to Soviet Union animation. So I just kind of jump in a bit in the line that somehow imagination, the things that I could do in during my residency. However, at the end, of course, I will try to talk through my image of my existence in that interesting place later on. Later on, they understood that maybe they could start to produce animation for kids. And this is actually the first and somehow the only successful one. And it's the only series of animation that Zagreb Film produced, directed by Zlatko Gergic. The guy in the left of this image. And this is Zagreb Film still exists in the center of Zagreb. They're trying actually to produce animation. Of course, the golden age of Zagreb animation, Zagreb school is past, and they don't have money, of course. They don't have that structure to produce animation, but it's still, there is a functionality is going on. And this is very interesting. It's from Zagreb Film, and you could see that this is the editing room of Professor Bальтазар and the other animation film that they were producing during the 60s until 80s. But the golden age of animation production is between 60s and early 70s. This is a kind of like a golden age of production. How I contextualize and historicize that animation production, everything basically started with that particular event, which took place in 1948, Fifth National Congress of the Communist Party in Belgrade. It was the exact time that Tito gave 7-hour lecture and says that we want to stay being communist, we want to be socialist, we are very much following the Marxist legacy, but we don't want to follow Stalin and Soviet Union. And one of the main challenge for Tito in that period of time was Soviet Union and Stalin was trying to shadowing the idea of Yugoslav liberation during the Second World War. And Tito was strongly pushing partisan agenda that we partisan liberated Yugoslavia. And the fun part is that the Soviet Union embassy in Belgrade in 1947, 1 year before that event, wanted to introduce the role of Red Army in liberated Yugoslavia as a photo exhibition in Belgrade. That the one day before the opening of the exhibition, when Tito visited that exhibition, he noticed that there is no role of partisan in that exhibition. So he became very angry. There's a story, of course, a lot of stories about this guy, that he broke the windows of the exhibition and didn't let exhibition open. And then started to think that, okay, we need to kind of disregard ourselves from Soviet Union. Based on that form of idea, the different ways of production started. This is very interesting because this is animation. It's called Great Meeting by Walter and Norbert Nurberg, two brothers in Zagreb from Duga film, before Zagreb film in 1951. It's actually the first animation in post-war Yugoslavia, which technically is Disney-like animation. So, and we are making very clear distinction about the production of animation, because when we are talking about Disney animation, we are talking about 24 frames per second to get a very natural and light and soft movement. But they were following actually that form of Disney animation production. But later on, they understood that they cannot follow that because first of all, they didn't have the infrastructure and money that Disney had as a capitalist institution. And so they changed that format of animation to limited animation, which is 6 to 8 to 12 frames per second, and design everything according to that form of movement, which is a little bit, as you could see in the animation, is not really realistic animation in a way. But one very important aspect into that was they reduced the number of production of the frame in order to pay equally to the labor who was working. So it's quite interesting that they were practicing that form of idea. So the first animation, the Duga film in 1951, made commissioned by a state, was criticizing mainly Albania, Anwar Hoxha, and Stalinist political mentality during the Cold War in the region. Later on, Tito understood that, okay, so if we are not going to be part of East, neither part of West, we need to find allies in the other geography. So because of course, not himself, but people around him suggested that, okay, so go toward Global South. This is the very interesting image from the Archive of Museum of Yugoslavia. The part of this project was very much close relationship with the archive that they have in that museum. It was a meeting that Tito met Jamal Abdel Nasser, the president of newly independent Egypt, and Jawaharlal Nehru, the president of newly independent India. And they got to the agreement, and that agreement was Brioni meeting, Brioni summit, that somehow is not actually the history of non-aligned movement, and Maria briefly mentioned that, but it's kind of the point of departure of getting to that direction, that we need to create solidarity within Global South against capitalism and communism, against East and West simultaneously, and position ourselves in the middle of that political dichotomy. From 1956, there was very interesting, of course, environment that took place at the end in 1961 with 26, 27 newly independent countries from the colonial past that they met in Belgrade. And later on, that political characteristic was named in mid-70s as non-aligned movement, which is still continuing. However, of course, in the second chapter of my PhD book that hopefully is coming out in April, I describe that the problematic of non-aligned movement too. So I'm shortly just historicizing the backdrop of that background and backdrop of my work in a way. So somehow there was one slogan that comes out from that meeting. They said, neither East nor West. We don't want to be part of any ally with any of them. As perhaps you look at, when we were watching Professor Bальтазар, there were some posters in the background of Bальтазар Grad. So because Bальтазар Grad is a real city, there are posters on the wall. And one of them is quite interesting. This is actually a still image of the other episode of Professor Bальтазар, which is called Happiness for Two, made in 1967. Short story is about a policeman in Bальтазар Grad that he has a strong desire to be a clown. And so one day make a decision and said, okay, I want to be a clown. I don't want to be a policeman. And he started to act as a clown. Of course, people start to laugh at him because policemen should be masculine and serious. They ask the main general of the city to come and fire him. So the main general came and fired him. He became very miserable. He went to Professor Bальтазар and asked, what should I do? Professor Bальтазар invented by that machine a specific gesture, that if you do that specific gesture, you could travel to the realm of harmless irrationality. But one condition: in order to travel to the realm of harmless irrationality, you need to find your soulmate. And the policeman was looking at the soulmate in the city and suddenly saw the general, the main officer of the city who fired him, has a very strong desire to vandalize the posters on the wall of Professor Bальтазар Grad. So he found his soulmate. They need to do something irrational. They did this, the gesture, they traveled to the realm of harmless irrationality. Back to the previous slide. Well, I think you kind of see actually who were they mocking in the background of that animation. This is Marilyn Monroe and Andy Warhol, which was painted in 1965. And in 1967, when they were producing that episode of animation, Marilyn Monroe, Andy Warhol, pop art was everywhere. They didn't use direct critique. They take it, put it in the backdrop. For 3 seconds, ask the main general of the city to vandalize it. So if I want to say that the notion of neither East nor West, how is elaborated itself within the philosophical, political mentality of those people that they're producing, Professor Bальтазар and the other animation in Zagreb film, I could say that that form of critique was very smart critique that they were using, and this is the best example of that critique. And you could see that idea neither East nor West is quite function here because, well, you know, just we have pop art, Andy Warhol, which is somehow representative of American art in the backdrop, but well, we could actually vandalize it. We could make fun of it. And you could see the other posters in the backdrop. So part of the things that I did in the exhibition was take out those posters from the backdrop, redesign them, and give a very specific reference that when you see those images. And it's quite interesting, of course, you know, part of the historical analysis or historical tracing that I have done, it was a relationship between Zagreb Animation School and also the abstract movement in Yugoslavia named as Exact 51, which was kind of, they were very much connected. So the abstract movement was very much embedded in Zagreb film animation. The other cultural production that you could see famously in a way in Yugoslavia is those anti-fascist monuments that they're everywhere in Yugoslavia, and they were started to appears in the late 50s to 80s. And we have numbers of that, different categories and different ways. Wrongly, in a kind of like a, you know, if you look at what is it, wrongly they were defined as brutal architecture, which is wrong definition for that. So there is one very interesting thing. Again, is very much related to the political challenge that Tito and Stalin had, Soviet Union and Yugoslavia had, because all the places that you could see, vast majority of them, that you could see those gigantic abstract monument there, which is basically in the middle of nowhere. So you're traveling in the former Yugoslavian countries, and you have to really look for those monuments. They are not necessarily located in the middle of city or close to city. So they are in the middle of nowhere in somewhere in the wood. During the Second World War, all the places that now there is a monument, there was partisan activities or partisan camp. So, and all the partisan activities was in the middle of nowhere, hence the monument is in the middle of nowhere. But now the monument is visibilizing the invisible resistance during the Second World War. There is some very much anti-Stalin mentality, of course, behind production of those monuments, which is interesting. So we have two monuments here. We have a monument to the invisible citizen. I'm translating and interpreting from Serbo-Croatian language. However, the English, as you watched, translated to unknown, but Martin was known. People started to miss it. So invisible, in my point of view, was better word to use. So we have one monument, which was the podium to the invisible citizen, because they didn't remember Martin. And also we have, of course, the foundation of that monumental practice in Yugoslavia in that period of time. And so based on that combination, I started to think that how is it possible to reinterpret these two forms of cultural production together and create a hybrid object into that? And of course, ended up in that monument as a form of playground. Curated by Bettina Paschun when she was director of Marble Parken in 2018. So we create playground, named as the monument to the invisible citizen. The exhibition travels to Malmö Kalmar Museum and then Malmö Kunst Museum. And then I started to elaborate the notion of exhibition as a playground a little bit further, because it was actually the form of practice that I started to think that, okay, how is it possible to play with that idea of exhibition a little bit? How is it possible? As you could see here in Malmö Kunst Museum, is a very large space. I decided to put the monument almost in the center in that large corridor. So hoping that when kids are coming into the exhibition, they immediately saw the monument, and of course they aggressively play with that monument. So it's a kind of very functional piece. Actually, it's not really symbolic for kids. They think it's a very nice slide. They use it in a very aggressive way. They see the monument in the center of exhibition and they run toward that. So as you could see, I didn't really block anything in the middle. So it's a kind of passive way for kids to run. So, well, during 6 months, almost 6 months exhibition in Malmö, it wasn't very pleasant for the people that they were working there, because they had to deal with the kids that they were thinking that they're actually in the playground. And one step further, at the end of the exhibition, there was a permanent workshop that kids could work. It was kind of like a semi-Bальтазар drug place that a couple of 4 symposium took place here, and a serious symposium for adults, and a lot of activities for kids based on the question and notion of history, Professor Bальтазар, who is invisible citizen, so on and so forth. And then the exhibition travels to Art Encounter Biennale in Timișoara, co-curated by Maria Lin. And it was very interesting in Timișoara, in the border of Romania and Yugoslavia, that the older generation of people living in Timișoara, they remember Professor Bальtазar based on the TV signal that they could receive from Yugoslavia. So suddenly the form of memory became memory beyond border, because, you know, they could not really stop the television signal. The interesting part that Maria curated that and locate that work in Timisoara was, it was disseminated in the city. So there was 3 venues that the different part of the project was being presented, and the monument was located in shopping city in the largest shopping center in Timisoara. That is quite interesting to see that how and what happened for those these specific object when it travels in different location and places. The last exhibition that I had was in Zagreb in June 2020 in Croatian Society of Fine Art, Hadelu. For me was kind of main question that, okay, I'm bringing back the project to Zagreb. What does it mean? So we decided with very interesting curators that I worked with, and they were very involved, Anna Kovacic and Leavena, from the beginning of this project, and they were really helping me to materialize and work with that idea based on the residency and everything that they created for me, was to, okay, the idea is to donate this monument to the city of Zagreb. Is it possible to present the exhibition as a place that those people that they want to have that monument could come and look at the monument? And then formally, newspaper, media announced that this monument will be donated to the city of Zagreb and send us proposal. So we received 16 proposals, and at the end we decided to donate it to Ivana Gundolica elementary school, which is public school focusing on national minorities. So now this piece is permanent piece in the city of Zagreb, is located in the schoolyard of that public school, but that schoolyard is not separated from the street. So basically is part of, is attached to a street basically. So whenever that you go to Zagreb, you could basically go and visit that playground and play with that. So this is short story. Within that story and project, this specific project that I have been working and elaborating, there were some questions for me that I was trying to develop or think through. So the first one that I mentioned after Maria's introduction, that what is the future of our collective past? The collective past, in my point of view, is contemporary history, the near history, the things that I have a memory of. Based on that notion of past, I define it as a form of tracing of my memory. I've grown up with Professor Bальтазар. Is it possible to trace it in order to understand how I know Professor Bальтазар, why I know Professor Bальтазар? In this presentation, I didn't have proper time to describe what was the Iran role to buying Professor Bальтазар from Yugoslavia, but of course in my text, I tried to describe it somehow. The question of modernity is very interesting for me, East-West modernity, and also the political neutrality in the context of modernity. Political neutrality is partly, of course, related to non-aligned movement, but political neutrality is very much related to Swedish political identity during the Cold War, that I really like to dig more into that. The third question was what happened to art when it crosses the border? What is the notion of that transnationalism? What is the border anyhow? The fourth question is very much kind of related to our field, what exhibition does. And I learned and started to think about the very crucial question during the when Maria was the director at Tensta Kunsthalle in Stockholm, that there was a series of talk about what exhibition does, which was very influential for me. And I started to think more and more about that idea based on that information and knowledge that I received from Tensta Kunsthalle. I think it was 2015 or 16, Maria, if I'm not mistaken. The last one that I really like to elaborate is playground as a possible future for social monument. That how is it possible to think about social monument, future of monument and social monument as a form of playground. Thank you so much.
Большое спасибо за презентацию. Это совершенно потрясающий рассказ. Дорогие участники, я вижу, что у нас и много классных кураторов, и художников, и художниц, и кураторок в звонке. Если у вас есть вопросы или комментарии к рассказу Behzada, пожалуйста, поднимите руку, и будем рады их услышать. Если интерфейс не позволяет поднять руку, то, наверное, вы просто можете начать говорить, и мы как-то с этим соотнесемся.
Maybe I can be the icebreaker and ask you, Behzad, if you can tell us a little bit about the background of Professor Bальтазар and Iran, where you yourself grew up.
Sure, is actually quite interesting. Well, you know, I born in 1976, and I grown up during the 80s in Iran. During the 80s in Iran, of course, it was first of all, it was a couple of years after revolution, so it was quite a dark time, especially in relation to leftist ideology. And also the war between Iran and Iraq started, which continued for 8 years. So somehow the question is that that nor west, neither east, which is actually the main legacy of non-aligned movement, despite that relationship between Iran and non-aligned movement, became the main slogan of foreign policy of Iran. They still have that neither east nor west on top of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iran. So based on that idea that, okay, we don't want to follow these two hegemonies, we need to find a third way. So a couple of people within the official structure of institution started to introduce specific filmmakers and animations and cultural production from neutral countries. And Yugoslavia was one of them. Sweden was another one. Because at the same time that I grown up with Bальтазар, I grown up with Bamse, the Swedish product animation. And the other animation production that is kind of, you know, Iran was buying it from Sweden. And it was kind of easy for them to justify it to the power structure that they are actually neutral production. And it wasn't just about animation. For example, Tarkovsky was very much celebrated because Tarkovsky was kind of like a middleman. He was Russian, but he was kind of producing some film in Sweden. So they could actually bring it into Iran. So that notion of neutrality within the cultural production, at least in animation and film, became very strong. However, of course, in painting and mural that you could see in Tehran, after revolution, Iran went to the other path, which was very much following social realism. So there is kind of like a diversity in that. But economically, in that period of time, Iran didn't have very close economical relationship to Yugoslavia. Tito was very good friends of Shah, the Shah of Iran before revolution. And one of the only things that they shared, because Shah was very much, of course, against leftist ideology. But one thing that Tito and Shah was sharing was Shah even told him that the only countries, only leaders of the countries who could defeat Stalin was Iran and Tito, Shah and Tito, Iran and Yugoslavia. So this is actually kind of complex relationship that Iran and Yugoslavia had. During the war between Iran and Iraq, Yugoslavia was strongly supporting Iraq. So it was very close allies to Iraq, making bankers, making hotels, making everything basically for them. So it's kind of sort of complexity of the political relationship that Iran had, well, during the 80s, even now, of course, with a lot of different countries in the world, especially neighbor countries.
Спасибо большое за ответ, Наталья.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the opportunity to get well, a chance for participating in this brilliant event and for very valuable information describing the concept of this work. I also have probably a little bit something like a conceptual question connected with this project. This is the project describing a monument to an unknown citizen. And this citizen is a male citizen predominantly. And my question is about unknown female citizens. Their stories may be different, and they are different, in fact. I'm also, a person who was born in Soviet Union, and I'm 40 years of age, and my reminiscences, my memories about the Soviet Union are different from those of people, from male reminiscences, male memories. So what about monuments to unknown female citizens? Thank you very much.
Well, it's very important questions, of course, and because part of that project is 2 films that I made. It's a form of documentary film historicizing that idea of the production of Zagreb film, and partly focusing on Professor Bальтазар. And it was one of my questions that what was the role of female? How many female directors working in Zagreb film? And not, of course, metaphorically as you phrase it as kind of what is the role of invisible female, but this is actually a very crucial question that vast majority of the laborers who work in Zagreb film, that they were kind of like a lower ranking, not director, not the intellectual, not the kind of creative part, but they were colorists in betweener and liner, they were female. So partly, mainly in 2 exhibitions, in Stockholm, in Sweden, in all 3, partly I'm showing actually some of the original drawing of Professor Bальтазар, not as a fetish of the archive, but contextualizing as an invisible labor behind the production. So, and if you look at that period of time, well, everything was very much male-dominated culture. And now, of course, we have a generation of animation director in Zagreb film, female animation director in Zagreb film, that they're producing amazing job, of course, and with the kind of consciousness about the gender role and representation. So your question is very much right in relation to invisibilization of the labor of female body. Yeah. And perhaps it's just kind of during the Cold War, everything and everywhere was very much male-dominated culture.
Well, females have to make our voices heard. Yes, this is a part of our today's reality, and I'm always feeling very strong about it, you know. Thank you very much. Well, a brilliant presentation, a lot of ideas for my further development. Thank you very much.
Amazing. I'm very happy about
it. Если позволите, я хотел задать небольшой вопрос, связанный с как раз в каталоге выставки, которая проходила в Мальме, отдельный текст как раз с Аней Хорватничич «Синегдаха Югославия», посвящен еще и революции в переделывании и трансформации дизайна детских площадок. который происходит, видимо, в то же время, что и как раз взлет Загребской школы анимации. И я хотел спросить, как раз, когда проект находил физическое воплощение в виде как раз детской площадки, ну, отсылали ли вы как раз к этому буму дизайна и обращались ли как раз к истории дизайна детских площадок того же времени, которая напрямую не связана с Бальтазаром, ну, и не явлена в кадре, но при этом явлена в самой Югославии? Потому что это тоже какой-то, может быть, ну, интересная ось, помимо той, что вы обозначили с антифашистскими монументами и тем, что было в кадре. Спасибо.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Indeed, I did. Indeed, I did the research about the production of monument in different locations, and I look at the production of playground in Soviet Union and United States, and also Yugoslavia. You mentioned Sanya's work, and she's one of the interesting scholar working with the anti-fascist monument in former Yugoslavia's countries. So a lot of argument that I have about Yugoslav monument and anti-fascist monument is somehow influenced by her scholarly working, and I interviewed her. She's part of my film, of course, and she's a great friend. So for example, we even traveled and visit some of those monuments. Certainly I can share some of her writing about it. And interestingly, she started her text in the catalog with quoting one of the urban planner and Yugoslav architect that a playground is the kids' factory. So basically, when kids are playing in that playground, they're actually working. This is their work. And the right to the play, you know, as a kind of human right, kids' right, is actually a very new subject, new context, new right. So elaborated actually as a legal right after Second World War. If I'm not mistaken, I can check it again, but I think it was 1953. So that kids, playing is kids' right. And interestingly, of course, is one part, of course, that was, of course, in Yugoslavia, they were really thinking about it. And also in some countries like Sweden, because Sweden was very much pioneer in that sense too. It was quite interesting to historicize that idea. And of course, Soviet Union, Russia was very much into that kind of, well, there is a kind of like a parallel history that was taking place simultaneously. The second question that you mentioned was materiality of playground. Yes, the materiality of playground, the form of playground that you could see here is one of the earliest form of playground which has been designed ever. And I think it goes actually after First World War, which kind of 1918, 1920s. And they were using the metal pipe, and it's called monkey bar. So because kids go and play like a monkey, so they call it monkey bar. And so the early design, of course, if you see it, is quite brutal, because it's the critique in that period of time, one of them says that I will never let my kids go and play with that monkey bars because it's dangerous. So again, that, you know, how kids, but, you know, sometimes, for example, in that specific playground monument that I made, so always we were thinking about the angle of the slide, because we need to have, of course, some sort of safe angle. And then there was a lot of cushions that people could sit around the podium. And then in the first day of the opening of the exhibition in Marble Park here, we understood that kids were taking those cushions, taking it up, sitting on it, because they could actually make it faster. And we said, okay, that is kind of, you know, they know what they're doing. Yeah. So the part of the project, of course, is kind of digging into the history of playground. That what is the materiality of it? Yes.
Спасибо большое. Дети, катающиеся как обезьянки и разгоняющиеся с горки, это просто невероятный праздник. И тем удивительнее, тем на самом деле приятнее, что ваш проект будет в России, потому что как раз демократизация детских площадок в России идет очень долго, очень тяжело. и как раз знакомые планировщики очень жаловались на невероятное количество нормативов, которые просто удушают их чувством опеки, не позволяя создавать пространства, в которых как раз ребенок может прыгать как обезьянка и быть, в общем-то, заниматься своим детским трудом. В общем, в России это происходит медленно, и интересно будет посмотреть, в каком контексте и как вообще в уральском контексте проект заживет, и, в общем, сколько детей он доведет до исступления радостного. Но сейчас я бы хотел, во-первых, спросить, если, друзья, участники звонка, если у вас есть вопросы, пожалуйста, как-то обозначьте их в чате, либо обозначьте их рукой, как сделал Владимир, которому я передаю слово.
Да, я просто как раз вот, перед тем, как перейти к следующей части, я хотел спросить у Бехзада о его ожиданиях. Мне кажется, это интересно, потому что я знаю, что он никогда еще не был в России, и тем более, ну, то есть он попадет не в Москву, Санкт-Петербург и даже не Екатеринбург, а какой-то небольшой промышленный город Свердловской или Челябинской области. И вот, ну, что, как ему кажется, он сам ожидает, да, от этого, и, ну, каким, ну, то есть катализатором каких процессов, да, может выступить вот его проект в нашем контексте?
Well, it's very interesting question. At the same time, of course, it's part of the. I started to imagine, of course, you know, and this imagination is not really new. I have been imagining about Russia and Soviet Union for a long time, because basically the relationship that Soviet Union and Russia since 19th century had with Persia and then Iran. So in that case, well, Russia, Soviet Union was a big bully brother in the north, and always there was some sort of a relationship with Iran, and pleasant and unpleasant relationship. But partly, of course, I certainly visit Moscow. I have to tell you, if I come to Russia, I definitely go and visit Moscow and I spend time there. But as a kind of like a being active participant to one city. I'm actually because I started to look at the location, look at the city, look at the surroundings. So now Google Map really help you to grow your imagination and travel to the place that you haven't been. And I'm quite interested to see take advantage of not being in the big city. Because this is actually one of the very crucial points of any form of grand history, that usually they're under the shadow of powerful explanation. Because we could have access to the larger city and the history behind them, but really the life was happening in those small cities surrounding the capital. And I'm all into decentralization. How is it possible to go to the kind of periphery and think that what was happening there during the very kind of crucial period of time? Because I like history, I'm very much locating everything that I do within history and see that how the history functions, how I can trace my memory or the other memory in that specific place. So in that case, I have to say that is actually very much related to the way that I work, that I don't necessarily work with the center. I don't work with the dichotomy, the good or bad. I'm working with something in between, or something which is not necessarily located in the center. So, well, I'm sure that I can find a lot of very good life there. This is I'm certain about.
Thank you.
Да, спасибо большое. Если у вас есть вопросы, то, пожалуйста, пишите их или, ну, в общем, как-то обозначайте, что вопросы есть. Еще я получил вопрос от наших коллег по биеннале И, в общем, оглашаю этот вопрос для вас. Если вас не затруднит написать в чат, откуда вы узнали о сегодняшнем событии? Был ли это Facebook или Instagram, или рассылка по почте? В общем, если вы просто можете написать, откуда вы пришли в сегодняшний звонок, в общем, мы с коллегами будем очень рады знать это. Вот, пожалуйста, пожалуйста, напишите в чат. Чувствую себя из-за этого обращения как ведущий телемагазина. Вот. Заранее спасибо. Вот, отлично, ура. И хотел, на самом деле, сейчас отметить, что мы закончили как раз с докладом и презентацией Behzada, и сейчас мы скорее переходим в режим открытого разговора. И вот вы очень внимательно сразу же отозвались, сразу же пишете. Будет также здорово, если вы также будете включаться в дискуссию. И я хотел, на самом деле, адресовать вопрос Марии, поскольку мне интересно даже скорее немножко узнать о вашей кураторской логике, когда вы принимали проект Behzada, в общем, в каком контексте вы его рассматривали, и насколько вам была важна как раз эта идея гражданской вовлеченности, детской вовлеченности, работы с трудом. То есть какие ключевые темы зацепили вас в практике Behzada, и если не будет слишком, не знаю, хамством, попросить вас очертить, возможно, генеалогию проекта Behzada, то есть где он для вас, в каком смысловом поле размещается, с какими проектами соседствует. Было бы очень интересно об этом узнать. Вот.
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, in order to work with any kind of art, it has to be great work. I'm really insisting on quality. It has to be something that I believe in, that I can stand behind. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I find it interesting and brave by Vladimir Seleznyov to, for the residency program, work with participatory art, because usually participatory art lends itself for long-term engagement, and a biennial doesn't often have that. And thinking then about how can we make this a successful project, which is interesting for the residency program, for the biennial, for the citizens of whatever city you, Behzad, end up working in, and also interesting for you as an artist. It has to be somehow a win-win situation. And I thought that knowing Behzad and knowing how you take on people whom you have not met before, that you are kind of a robust person. So even if you've never been to Russia and surely never to Ural, that you can deal with that challenge. And also that you take pleasure in getting to know people, exploring context. And I think if that is the basis, the potential of a project working is so much greater. And the idea of looking at the Cold War period, but looking at something that is beyond the East-West divide is relevant anywhere in Russia, I would say. And the same goes for the approach that you have taken, Behzad, which is connected to the notion of children's culture. It's also something that can work in many different contexts. So those were some of the concerns when I proposed you, Behzad, for this particular residency program. It's a little bit like thinking about what kind of work and what kind of artist can really make a project which is already almost running, so to speak, where we don't have to start from scratch, but there is already a certain kind of speed and impetus.
Надеюсь, что это еще и хорошо соотнесется с общей динамикой программы резиденции, в которой тоже города все больше открываются возможности делать что-то с художниками, работать вместе с художниками. Я на самом деле хотел Вову спросить о как раз работе с open call'ом городов и как вообще у вас сейчас идет эта наладка такого вовлеченного взаимодействия с городами.
Да, на самом деле, действительно, я тоже очень рад, что мы приняли такое решение, не просто, заезжать в какой-то город, да, и там, не знаю, использовать какие-то административные ресурсы или что-то еще, предлагать проекты, а начать разговор вот с самого начала, да, то есть от того места, куда мы поедем, должен быть изначальный импульс, то есть мы, следуя этому импульсу, начинаем диалог, понимаем, какие моменты интересуют людей, да, которые послали заявку, какие моменты интересны нам, и это тоже такая очень серьезная, на самом деле, почему мы, допустим, до сих пор не можем огласить список, потому что работа идет до сих пор, потому что, то есть очень много каких-то вещей должны сойтись вместе, да, чтобы... Потому что действительно это, принимая такое решение, я понимал, что это будет очень сложно и как продакшн, да, то есть 10 разных городов за такой короткий срок мы должны сделать и выставку, или, или какой-то объект, или продакшн. В общем, у нас ресурсы наши не безграничны, более того, они минимальны, можно сказать. Команда тоже небольшая. В общем, это серьезное испытание будет для нас, и поэтому но при этом, да, мы хотим, чтобы с самого начала это было как раз вот таким вот обоюдным желанием городов и нас как институции, да, делать что-то совместное. Поэтому, мне кажется, это такой логичный шаг вот в этой децентрализации.
Спасибо. Как раз мы получили вопрос от Дмитрия Белкина. Простите, я его не сразу увидел, потому что я подумал, что это название рассылки. А вопрос звучит как «Смогут ли взрослые играть на детской площадке?» И он, я думаю, адресован одновременно и Владимиру, и Behzaду.
Мы постараемся рассчитать эту конструкцию, чтобы и взрослые смогли. Мне кажется, это важно, почувствовать себя ребенком.
Behzad, а у вас был опыт как раз, чтобы взрослые тоже использовали площадку для
Well, this
детского
monument
труда?
is from 2 years to 80 years. So, and the fun part was a lot of course, adults who play with that slide was the first time that they were sliding down after maybe 60 years, 70 years. So, yeah, well, so it's kind of the whole exhibition is cross-generational exhibition. So, well, kids needs to be taking care of adults. So there's a kind of like because we try, of course, we don't present it as a playground. This is an artwork. It's not playground, because if you define it as a playground, you have to go, as you mentioned, you have to go to a lot of regulation. So it's not a playground. It's a kind of, it has to be in a controlled environment. Well, yes, yeah, well, of course, yeah, we have to play with that. We have to watch Professor Bальтазар again, even now.
I have a comment, if I may.
Yeah, sure. And then Natalia would ask the question.
I think it's interesting to look at your artwork, your monument, Behzad, in relation to an exhibition that happened in Stockholm in 1968 at a museum called the Modern Museum, which in essence is Sweden's Museum of Modern Art. An artist from Copenhagen called Palle Nielsen, together with a writer and theoretician, Gunilla Lundahl, who was based in Stockholm and who had lots of contacts with activists, together they shaped an exhibition which was called The Model, a model for a qualitative society. And this was essentially a giant playground, but only for children. So one of the big exhibition spaces of the museum was turned into this adventure playground for 3 weeks. So there were structures that you could climb on. There was a big pool of foam, which the kids can jump in. There were old costumes from the opera that they could dress up in. They could paint, they could do woodwork. There were LP records, they could play with them, etc. And for the artist Palle Nilsson, it was essential that it was a model. He thought that the only way forward in society of the late 60s was actually to look at children and the play of children in order to reach some kind of qualitative society. This was a tremendous success. I think 30,000 kids came to play there during 3 weeks. There were also an involvement by street activists, and it was
the connection went off.
Maria's internet is disrupted. So I can continue that by adding a comment that Palle Nilsson exhibition is somehow the kind of historical background of my project, and Rebecca Tour wrote in the catalog exhibition about that form of relationship, historical relationship.
And what is good to remember also with the 1968, the model project, is that the understanding of play by Palle Nilsson and was from as if children are just playing freely, as if there are no constraints, as if there are no structures or filters, etc. And simply, if we look at how the life of children today is organized, we immediately can identify that it's highly commercialized, for instance, and it's also regulated in different ways than it was in the late 60s. So I think it's an important and interesting background, and it also helps us see differences in terms of how the understanding of children in the context of Sweden, at least, has changed.
Большое спасибо вам за комментарии и за эту контекстуализацию. Я еще полагал, что вы отошлете к проекту, название которого от меня сейчас ускользнуло, но который представлял собой как раз каталогизацию детских площадок, каждая из которых представляла, по сути, как раз гипотезу о том, как следует в общем, как следует организовывать быт и жизнь детей, которые, очень скоро перестанут быть детьми и будут взрослыми. Но, к сожалению, мне вылетело из головы, я обязательно, не знаю, пришлю в чат. Наталья, у вас был вопрос, и я передаю вам слово.
Well, thank you again for this brilliant opportunity to share some ideas and, get enormous food for further development in my personal life. And my next question may be directed to both to Maria Lind and to Behzad. So my question concerns the publications describing this project. As a person who represents Ural Federal University, I am professor myself and working for this university, teaching various subjects, not only connected with arts and social life, but also even programming sciences. So I'm deeply interested in some feedback in forms of publications, public domain repositories. So could you please provide any light or any feedback on this point also? So is it possible to read more about the concept of this project somewhere online or probably in journals? Thank you very much.
I can maybe start to answer the question that, well, yeah, there is, we produced a catalog when the exhibition was at Malmö Kunstmuseum. So there's a catalog with 2 texts and the interview that Bettina Persson did with me. There is an interview in an art magazine based in Berlin. It's called This is the Bad Land. And somehow I try to contextualize the work there. There are, well, various short review and critique in different newspapers that if you just search the title of the project, it comes both in Sweden and Croatia. So it was well received actually by media, but mainly they are kind of, I'm sure that Google Translate works, of course, and you could see that how Swedish media received the work and how Croat media received that. And then recently I wrote an article published by a journal in Canada. It's called Public Journal, which the theme was hospitality, and they thought that the way that I'm looking at the history is very much relevant to the notion of hospitality. And this project and surrounding stories that I call it Marginalia is going to be the 2nd chapter of my PhD book, which is going out in April. So, yeah.
And there...
also, sorry, and also within the Timișoara Biennale, it was partly that not necessarily directly toward that specific project, but somehow Maria asked me to write, and I decided to write about the notion of translation, translatability in a kind of conceptual way. So what, in my point of view, that very short text that I provide for Art Encounter Biennale was very much related to the concept behind this project.
And just briefly, in relation to the model project in 1968 at the Modern Museum, there are 2 publications, one edited by Lars Bang-Larsen and one that he and I co-edited a couple of years ago. So those are the ones that I'm aware of. I can write it in the chat.
Okay. Well, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Behzad. Well, I am also interested in our Soviet legacy and post-Soviet legacy and interpretations of these themes in different countries. And this project is a valuable contribution to my framework of material. And I'm going to share it with Euro students, and when the opportunity presents itself, we will be privileged to see it with our own eyes, while our impressions will only increase. And in order to get ready for this meeting with this piece of art, of course, we need some conceptual background. So probably publications may serve as conceptual backgrounds to perceiving the art itself. Thank you very much.
Да, спасибо большое. Еще хотел сказать, что мы как раз условились, что будем собирать Behzaду тексты, сопряженные как раз с советской индустриализацией, с опытом осмысления как раз и индустриализации и архитектурных трансформаций Свердловской области. И будем набирать какой-то такой тоже небольшой список чтения, который будет связывать новую итерацию памятника невидимому гражданину с регионом. Тоже будем этим наверняка делиться. Хотел еще сказать, что если вдруг у вас еще остаются какие-то вопросы, то можно их задать. И если вопросов нет, то я думаю, что мы можем поблагодарить всех участников сегодняшней встречи. Отдельное гигантское спасибо Марии за прекрасную контекстуализацию и рассказ о генеалогии этого проекта, знакомства Владимира с Behzaду за то, что мы совершенно получили эту удивительную возможность посмотреть мультфильм про профессора Бальтазара и увидеть политический контекст, в котором он производился. И спасибо Вове за то, что он презентовал как раз рамку программы и рассказал, что будет происходить дальше. Ну и, конечно же, всем участникам. И замечу еще, что эта встреча, можно сказать, инаугурационная, и нас дальше каждый месяц будут ждать встречи, посвященные другим проектам программы арт-резиденций. И мы также в зависимости от эпидемиологической ситуации будем собираться либо в Zoom, либо офлайн, но, скорее всего, в Zoom. Так что следите за новостями в тех социальных сетях, где вы нас читаете. И мы постараемся регулярно делать такие контекстуализирующие разговоры, которые посвящены и программе, и прекрасным проектам, которые ее образуют. Вот. Еще раз большое всем спасибо.
Can I add something before we completely switch off? I hope that when Behzad's residency has happened, all of you will not only remember the song of Professor Bальтазар, but also that you will be able to hum it. It is something that those of us who grew up with Professor Bальтазар, it's a song that actually makes you smile every time you hear it. And the other thing is that, as you mentioned, in relation to the art residency program overall, that this is the beginning, and it goes also for this residency, that we're discussing the possibility of a series of webinars contextualizing specifically Behzad's project, and perhaps we could discuss notions of the monument, etc. And art in the public sphere is deeply interesting and deeply relevant these days. So I would like to point you to Behzad's contribution to a project that I started last year when I was working independently for a couple of years and thinking about what are the infrastructures that contain some kind of publicness that I can use as an independent curator, that don't cost anything, that are easily accessible. Obviously, Instagram is one of them. So if you look at 52 proposals for the 20s, I will write it in the chat in a second, you will see that last week, Behzad inhabited this account. I'm inviting one artist per week to inhabit the account to make proposals for the 20s, for the new decade. I'm writing it in the chat right now. And this week it's Dora Garcia, and funnily enough, her post today is in Russian. It's a handwritten note by Alexandra Kollontai, where she talks about how Lenin had just passed her office. This must have been in 1917 in December, or possibly in January 1918, and they decriminalized abortion.
That's a fantastic coincidence, and thank you for sharing. And I guess that we will post it in our social networks as well, so it would be accessible for everyone. And Kollontai is a beautiful pun. Ну, наверное, на этом действительно уже будем заканчивать, и Мария совершенно верно указала на то, что мы еще будем делать отдельные семинары, посвященные как раз искусству в публичной сфере, социальному монументу как раз такому сгустку гражданских воль. Вот, в общем, мы будем к этому обращаться, и как раз Мария знакомит нас с исследователями, которые как раз работают с культурной памятью, с проблемой как раз исторической памяти, и, в общем, будем к этому обязательно обращаться. Вот. На этом все. Еще раз всем большое спасибо и до встречи.
Спасибо огромное.
And thank you for excellent moderation.
Да,
Thank you
спасибо,
so
Дима.
much. It was great. Thank you so much. I'm very much looking forward to meet you in person and start to work together.
О, да. Спасибо.
Мы тоже в нетерпении. Спасибо.
Ciao, ciao.